Hello and welcome to another episode of Hashmap Megabytes. My name is David Herntzer, and today I'm going to walk you through part two of the Snowflake Data Sharing. And part two is going to deal with sharing not only within the same cloud provider and region, but also across cloud platforms. Remember, the part one was the same cloud, same region. Part two, we're going to jump across to go to different cloud platforms. So let's get going. All right, real quick, we're going to just kind of barely go through some of these slides just because we did it already on part one. But I did provide the link to the Snowflake documentation on data sharing. Again, great info. But one more time to pare it down, data sharing really is a provider or consumer concept, if you will. Tables, external tables, views, right? Materialized views, all via a share. And again, think of a share as in terms of like a file share, right? You add objects or add files to that file share, you share it out. When someone consumes, they get to see it. Same thing here, except through Snowflake, when you create a share, you're actually adding database objects to it. And then, of course, when someone consumes that, they get to see all the database objects. Once again, Snowflake has two types of sharing. Really, it's kind of a Snowflake account-based, and then non. Non will be the third party, again, where the provider provides the data and the compute and everything. And the second one is, of course, where everyone has their own Snowflake account. And there's roughly three in there. We have same cloud and region, different cloud or region and marketplace. And today, our focus is going to be on sharing across different cloud or region. All right, I won't go through this slide again. Again, this is the exact same slide from part one, but I did want to put it here in case those who didn't watch part one, you want to see some of these, you can pause it here, read through these things, but it just kind of gives the difference between kind of traditional sharing and then how Snowflake data sharing really changes the game. All right, our use case, once again, is exactly the same. I'm a Snowflake customer, and I want to share sales data with a client. The players, once again, are exactly the same. My provider is a Snowflake account, and my client or my consumers are also Snowflake accounts. What drastically changes here are the parameters. So the consumer now resides in a different cloud or region other than the provider. For our purposes here, we're going to be different clouds. So our host is going to be in AWS for this example, and my consumer is going to be in Azure. So once again, the other three apply still. No direct access to the tables. We're going to use secure views only, and we're going to abstract that. And again, we'll kind of walk through what that abstraction layer does. And then we're also going to say, as another parameter is our order and customer data is filtered dynamically. So that view that we're providing is kind of a dynamic view that changes, or that can be changed based on configuration data and not DDL. And then the last one, multiple clients can use the same data sets as in part one. And again, we're going to kind of carry over. I'm going to walk through parts of part one to kind of set up the data, and you're going to see, actually, we're going to kind of prove that we can also share, while we're sharing the same data within the same cloud and region, we're also going to kind of share that data across cloud providers. So what does this mean from a 30,000 foot view? Well, I drew a really ugly diagram to show this. So over here we have our AWS cloud. We're in US West, Oregon. And then we have our consumers are going to be, the ultimate consumer is going to be in Azure, so East US 2 in Virginia. So the blue boxes here that you see in each cloud represent our providers' accounts, right? It's the people who are going to host the data. So the primary database is going to be inside the AWS, and it's under our Hashmap account. And we're going to have, just like in part one, we're going to have a share opened up to this consumer account that's also inside AWS. But then we have to go through the great cloud void, right? We have to get that data out of the AWS Snowflake account into the Azure Snowflake account. So again, we're going to duplicate those databases across the platforms, and so it's going to show up as the exact same databases, but replicated into this account. And just like in the AWS, we're going to have a Azure consumer that's going to be in the same region as this one, so they'll be able to be kind of set up in the exact same way. So I just wanted to kind of point this out and make sure everyone understands kind of the cross-cloud solutions. Technically, we're going to have 4 accounts. Did we really need this one here? Probably not. But we're going to have a provider in the primary account and a consumer. And then we're going to have a replicated provider and then a consumer from that replicated data. All right, let's jump right on into it. Get my worksheet up here. There we go. All right, so you're going to see I have 4 tabs open at the very top, and those 4 tabs are for each account that I made. You can see AWS Provider, AWS Consumer, Azure Provider, and Azure Consumer. All right, so once again, I kind of went through all this ahead of time so we don't waste time here creating these databases. I have one database here, and this, whoop, let me scroll down a little bit. I have one database here. This holds all my data. Once again, this is a copy of the TPCH SF1 data set, the smallest data set in the Snowflake sample data. And that's in this database. And then my configuration database has these three tables, and this is what's going to be used to control those dynamic views, right? We're going to kind of control the view based on configuration data. And I have all that data already set up in step 1. So let's go ahead and jump to step 2. Again, you're not missing a whole lot. This was part of the part 1 series. So this part right here changes a little bit. So what we're going to do in here is we're going to go ahead and set up that configuration data. So before, let me get my session set up here. So my database and my schema. Before, all we were doing was using this one AWS account to consume. Now we're going to have 2. I'm going to have, and this, remember, this registered accounts is my metadata. Think right here. Think a fictitious website that I have going where people can log in and they can register their Snowflake accounts, and then they can kind of have a shopping cart where they can go and purchase the different data sets they want to do, right? This kind of represents this registration piece. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to register these 2 accounts. These are my 2 consumer accounts. So 2 lines entered. And then I'm also going to go ahead and pretend each one of these chose Africa as their region that they wanted to consume data from at first. So let's go ahead and add these 2 rows. All right, so if I looked at registered accounts, I should have 2 in there now. I do. And for this, I should have both accounts, and they should be just Africa. So again, when we share these things out, the default view they should get is any kind of order or customer data is going to come back as Africa only. All right, step 2 is done. Step 3 is along the same lines of what we did, and we sort of don't have to do this, but I want to kind of show you the difference between same cloud, same region, and different cloud vendor altogether. So I'm going to run through this really quick. All we're going to do here is we're simply setting up the shared data set for our same cloud, same region consumer account. And again, just to kind of make sure we go over again, this SQL function that I'm building here is part of the where clause for these views. This is how I do it, right? I hit that account region access cross-reference table, and it kind of acts as our control table based on what account's logging in. That way on all these views, they only get to see what they purchased, right, through our fictitious website. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to highlight all these views, and I'm just going to run them very quickly. You can see some of the views have where they're using that secured access, or secured region, sorry, function, and some aren't, right? The ones where it's just open data, we don't really care. They can see everything. Go ahead and run this real quick. These should create really fast. All right, all done. And so for the next piece, we're going to create our share. So of course, if I'm creating something that's account-based, I have to log in with the account admin. And I'm going to create a share. And remember, a share is just a placeholder. It has nothing in it. So I have to go through and add all the objects I want. Again, I'm going to breeze through these. This is what we did in part 1 of this series. So I'm going to go ahead and add all these objects. And again, this is just to contrast, same cloud, same region, and different clouds. So, and I'm going to alter this share. I'm going to say that this account, which is my AWS consumer account, has access to this share. There we go. So if I show my shares, I should have one sitting there. There we go. My outbound share. All good. So step 3 is done. So step 4 is where things change from part 1 to part 2. And because in part 1, we're simply sharing we're simply sharing within the same cloud and same region. So I don't have to move data anywhere. We can all tie directly to the same data set, the provider's data set. Well, here now, we don't do that, right? If I'm going from AWS to Azure, I definitely want to make sure that my data is replicated over, because we don't want a ton of egress charges coming out, right? And plus, Snowflake doesn't allow it anyway. So this is the way you have to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and set up replication on these 2 databases that I want to share to my Azure provider account. So once again, I'm going to set up account admin because I'm making account changes. And I'm going to say on this database, I'm going to enable replication to this account. And this account is inside my Azure training area. So I'm going to go ahead and set up replication on this one, set up replication on this one. Then now if I go and show replication databases, I should see 2, and I do, both my test and my configuration. And you can see they're both shared out to the training area. And again, these are the primaries. So you see that nothing's being replicated yet because there's no consumers of this. It's just showing these. And if you ever want to look at what accounts that you have replication enabled, you can click Show Replication Accounts, and it will show that as well. All right, so real quick, before we jump over to the the Azure section, let's jump back in here. Let's make sure that all of our shared data that we just set up, let's make sure we can see everything. So I'm going to quickly come into my AWS consumer account and just make sure, just like in part one, that I can see the data that I'm trying to replicate and share over. So once again, I have to create the database from that share. If I say show shares, let me show that. I can see it here. I have one inbound share. So I'm going to go ahead and create a database off that share. And that fast, I have a shared data set. If I refresh this screen or refresh my view here, I'll see now my shared data set come across. All right, and if I run this statement, I should see my data. There we go. And you can see it's all coming up with Africa as well. So right now we're good. The AWS side is set up. I have all my databases set up. I enabled replication. So now I need to go to my Azure account, my other provider account, and get that data over there for my other Azure consumer. So I'm going to go ahead and jump over here. And again, it's kind of the same process, right? When I come into this Azure provider, it's kind of the same process of building all my initial data sets, except what I'm going to do is, I'm going to show replication accounts again, just so you see I have both of them. So this is in my AWS, and you can see it's in AWS West 2. And then I also have replication set up for my Azure US East 2. And I'm going to create a database inside here, just like I would on my other provider account. I'm going to give it to sysadmin as well. So these databases are now just placeholders, right? They're just sitting here ready. And what I did when I said create database, I made sure I put as replica of this database. So now that tells Snowflake, hey, when I kick off replication, when I say refresh this database, this is where you're going to pick up all the changes. And I'm going to do that. And we're going to talk about some of these things while this is going, because sometimes if it takes too long, I may go ahead and stop the video and then re-kick it off. I've seen this replication, there's a couple million rows I think in here. I've seen it take anywhere from 15 seconds up to 2 minutes. I guess it depends on how busy the Snowflake services are behind the scenes. But and again, what this is doing is it's saying, since I've never replicated anything, it goes back to that primary database that's sitting off in AWS, and it's saying, give me all the data and rebuild everything. Oh, it's already done. That was quick, 20 seconds. And rebuild everything inside of the Azure provider, right? I'm going to do the same thing for the configuration database. This should be quick. I think there's like 10 rows and like a few structures. Again, it's how fast they can queue it up and get it going. This runs, you can see my warehouse isn't running. This runs as inside of a warehouse running behind the scenes inside of Snowflake. And hopefully done here in a second. But again, what this is doing is strictly going back to this database and saying everything that's in that test config database that was in my AWS account. So this account right here and this database, I don't know why I have this expanded, but right here, all these tables, bring all these 3 data tables over. And we'll see why we're doing that in a second. And this one's deciding to take a little while. And if it doesn't come back in a second, I'm going to go ahead and pause. You know what? I may pause. And we're back. So I went ahead and paused because it took about 2 minutes. So I went ahead and paused on that one. And again, sometimes we're at the mercy of this, right? We don't exactly know what's being queued up behind the scenes. But once this was queued up, it ran. So it took about 1 minute, 54 seconds. Again, that's just something that happens there behind the scenes at Snowflake. No worries. And there, now if I query the database, actually, let me expand this so we can see them. So if I refresh this, we have a bunch of test databases in here. I can see all my config settings. I can see now that all my structures showed up. And if I query the data, of course, I see the 2 settings I initially put in on my AWS account. So now I'm knowing my replication processes are successful. Everything's working. I'm going to go ahead and very quickly do the same thing we did on the AWS side. I'm going to just grant all the privileges to sysadmin role, because remember, we don't want to be doing everything as account admin. We want to give everything back to the sysadmin role, or something that rolls up to the sysadmin role. All right, so step 1 is done. I have my data structures now reconstructed in Azure that they duplicate, basically, they replicate the ones that are inside AWS. So now I'm going to go ahead and go to step 2. And you're going to notice step 2 is exactly the same as it was. I think it's exactly the same as it was in AWS. I'm going to go ahead and set my credentials up to be sysadmin. I'm going to create the database. Again, I'm calling this dHernscher shared test sharedb, just like I did in AWS. I'm going to add the exact same function inside this one. Again, remember, The premise behind this is I'm creating an abstraction, right? I'm creating another database that's holding all of my stuff that I want to share, right? So that database contains all the views and any kind of functions, anything I want to do that's talking back to the other data sets, right? So that function is created, and then once again, I'm going to just highlight all of these views. So we're not wasting a ton of time doing this, since we just did this like 30 seconds ago. All right, so I'm going to create all the views, and once again, as soon as this is done, I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. So now we should see my new shared database in here. Right here we do. My shared schema. Remember, please don't name it like this. But I just wanted to show you kind of the secure shared view. Here they are. They all show up. Now, once again, I need to do the exact same thing I did before. I need to create a share, a Snowflake share. So I'm going to do the same thing. Notice I called my share dHernzer test different cloud share 1, just so we can make sure we're at a different place. And I'm going to go ahead and run all of these. And all this is doing, again, is just putting all those objects that I want to share into that share, so that when it's consumed, all these objects appear for the consumer. All right, there we go. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this share and I'm going to add the Azure sharing account to it, which is my consumer account. All right, so if I say show shares, I should have one. I have a few inbound here, but these are the ones from Snowflake. But the outbound here is the one I just created. So this is the one I'm looking at, and I'm shared to that account we just saw a while ago, that Azure consumer account. All right, and guys, that's it. That's really it. Just like we did on part 1, or just like we did again for the AWS provider, we do the exact same thing over here. Again, this would all be scripted out, right? You would run this as a what do you call it, automated process. But again, we're kind of running this manually so you can see all the steps. And as a tidbit down here, if you're going to refresh, you probably create some kind of task like this. This is kind of straight out of the Snowflake help. I would alter the database on some interval. This is doing like 2 a.m. and it's altering the database to refresh. So nightly, it's refreshing both those. I don't want to do that. I'm just saying this is how you would do it if you want to refresh it on an interval. There's many ways you could refresh the database, but ultimately what you have to do is alter the database and use the refresh parameter. All right, so let's jump into our consumer. Once again, this is exactly the same as the AWS consumer. You can see the code looks exactly the same. I'm going to say show shares. I need to go ahead and expand this so we can see. Nothing in here but the Snowflake default data that comes with Snowflake. And I can see right here I have an inbound share that I just created. So let's go ahead and use it. So I'm going to set up my session, account admin, set up my warehouse. Just like I did on the AWS consumer, I'm going to create me a database from that share. Now if I refresh this, everything should just show up. And it does. And you can see the inbound arrow. And there it is. There's all my views. So that quick, right? Just the same. Now I'm seeing the exact same data as before, right? So let's go run that query I just had. And we're going to kind of do some comparisons here. So here's the query on that data. And remember, a while ago, let me jump back over here. I'm seeing only Africa data. Because a while ago, when we set this up, let me scroll to the top here, we chose just Africa for both. So you can see for my AWS account, I chose Africa, and for my Azure account, I chose Africa. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add 2 more. So for AWS, I want that account, say they put Asia in their cart and checked out, and then the Azure folks put Europe in their cart and checked out. So I'm going to simulate that. I'm going to run both of these. Oh, I'm in the wrong database. There we go. All right, here we go. Let's make sure I did this right. Okay. Just had an extra statement there. All right, so now we see they both originally had Africa, and now the AWS consumer has Asia, and the Azure consumer has Europe. So let's quickly jump over to the AWS consumer again. And again, remember, this is one that's tied directly. Remember, same cloud, same region. It's tied directly to the data set. So if I go and run this query inside the AWS consumer, I'm going to see now I can see Asia and Africa, right? Both show up right away. Where if I go to the Azure consumer and I run that same statement, I'm only going to see Africa. Once again, I'm not hitting the primary data set, right? So say my website is updating this one data set, there'd probably be an event that would trigger something, right? And that data would be replicated over again. So I'm gonna go ahead and simulate that replication. Let's hope this one doesn't take a minute. It should be faster, hopefully. So I'm gonna come over here. Where is that? Right here. So on this config database, right, that I'm pulling from my AWS primary account, I'm gonna go ahead and replicate that. Let's hope it just takes like 5 seconds. It's 3 seconds. If it takes any longer, I'm going to pause it. And I'm going to pause. 1 second. All right, the Snowflake Shared Services evidently are pretty busy. What's probably happening is they're seeing my name, and it's probably hitting some spell check and exploding on my last name, since I have a very odd check last name. So now that data is replicated over, so if I come back over here, let's go ahead and go back to my provider account. And if I query that data set again, let's go down here. Where does my query? Oh, I don't have it turned on yet. Let's just do this. So registered accounts, account region access. I'm going to hit preview data. Now this is in my Azure provider account. And now we can see after I replicated, the other 2 rows show up. So again, this will probably be kicked off again by some event or maybe a nightly process. However, whatever the sync is needed to get that data replicated across in a time that an SLA that you worked out with your consumers. So now if I go back over here and run that exact same statement again, I should see Africa and Europe, and I do. So again, all runs exactly the same. Truly the only difference between part 1 and part 2 really is that we had to enable replication on the accounts. We replicated the databases, and then of course we actually replicated, right, and actually pushed that data over. But on the Azure side, we set up the provider the exact same way as we did on the AWS. And that kind of keeps the scripts the same, kind of keeps everything working the same. Shouldn't be really difficult to deploy this. So let's jump over here and go. I have 1 or 2 more little tidbits I want to show you. Oh, and again, we can look at this too. This was for the nation key, since that was kind of tied to, I did not tie that in correctly. Oh, I'm joining back to the regular data. That's all right. I just want to make sure that we're getting all the data we need. There we go. No problem at all. All right, so what I want to do is, again, I'm going to go ahead and grant imported privileges back to my sysadmin. I want to be running things as my sysadmin when I'm doing all my normal work, not just account stuff. So now logged in as sysadmin, I can see the data I want to see. All right, so as a last tidbit, I kind of want to show what we would do if I wanted to maybe present this data differently again to my internal folks, right? I want to maybe I want to have a hierarchical view of how they see this data, or maybe I just want to share it with better words. Maybe the data I'm replicating is very cryptic. The column names, maybe it's call 1, call 2, that kind of thing. I hope not, but you never know. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go ahead and use this app, and I'm going to go ahead and create a database called dhernzer extra. Hopefully Snowflake doesn't blow up on that last name. I'm going to go ahead and say use the public schema. This is available to anyone inside that gets to use my dhernzer extra database. And I'm going to create a view. And this view is going to kind of take the current view that's out of that shared test DB. It's going to put it in a new database and kind of give the names something a little more easier to read, a little more easier to identify. Do the same thing for customer. So if I refresh this, I should see everything in here. There we go. There's my dhernzer extra database. Inside the public schema, I now have 2 views. So now if I go and query from those 2 views, now look, I have a region key, region name versus like R region key and R name. Kind of give it some more descriptive names. Again, does this really change the thing a lot? No. But it does show you how you can abstract this data. If I do the same thing for customer, it shows you how you can abstract this, and plus that I can customize these views. Maybe they don't need to see all the fields. Maybe it's confusing. Maybe there's a lot of junk that they don't need to see. Again, I can replicate everything, so I don't have to worry about the replication side of it, because I replicate the entire database. But if I want to build a view on top of that shared view to maybe tailor it to my my customers, I can. And as a last added thing here, you cannot do, of course, a get DDO, right? Because you can't see the create statement. But what you can do if you want to kind of do some analysis and get the metadata behind the actual share, you can. You can run describe and get that data back to see what the columns are and everything. So I believe that's it. Let me see here. Let's go back to my wonderful drawing. If I can find the screen, there we go. All right, there we go. So, in summary, once again, Snowflake data sharing, extremely versatile, extremely powerful, powerful. We see how we can share from, like in part one, we can share from a provider to a consumer within the same cloud and region. And then now in part two, I can do that as well as share that exact same data set onto a whole different cloud, right, or a whole different region, however I want to rig that up. And again, guys, this is unlimited, right? Once you create a share, you can give this to an unlimited number of consumers. So again, our focus here on part two was, again, Snowflake account to account, but in a whole different cloud, right? And again, I just want to reiterate, the real only difference here is that we had to replicate a copy of the data. So if you have maybe vast data sets that you're doing, maybe you're keeping everything in one giant data warehouse, you may want to start looking at partitioning that data out into different data sets or different databases so that your shared data, you aren't replicating a tremendous amount of data that you need to share with your consumers. And again, we kind of walk through a real world case right on hooking up a configuration style cross-reference table, right? Again, we kind of had that fictitious website that would let us pick and choose who gets to register and who and what kind of data sets they want to view or what regions they want to view kind of in their shopping cart, right? So again, real world use case. Hopefully that helps you guys out, gives you a little overview of kind of sharing data, not only within same cloud, same region, but also a whole different cloud altogether. And again, hope you enjoyed this megabyte. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe for more Hashmap NTT content.